Hello again, Kevin. It's great to
Hiya,
see
Paul.
you. And we've been going through a little series
Yeah.
called Sailing, Storms, Shipwreck, and Shores. And we've only got through a little bit of the sailing yet.
We're still sailing or
Still
not,
sailing,
the
yeah.
case
Okay.
might be.
Okay. So we got through uh, Acts 27, the first three verses. So now we've got to verse 4 of Acts 27. So I will read that.
Okay.
From there, we put out to sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. Verse 4.
Yeah. It seemed to go well initially, didn't it? That journey. We talked about some of the problems Paul may have encountered and so forth, but they were able to actually sail. And verses 4 and 6 cover some issues. But I think initially things can go well when they start, and it shows us here that from there we put out to sea again. Everything was okay. They were still on the same ship. Nothing had kind of hindered them at this point. Nothing was kind of threatening them at this point, and it looked a fairly normal routine journey initially, and in that sense, it was doing okay. And I think that is the same in our lives too. You've heard of pastors will take on a new church or somebody will take on a new job, and they'll say they are at a honeymoon time, and initially it's going well. The new employee turns up and he's done a month, and he can be relied on, or he finds things that what was said in the interview is exactly what's in the job description and things like this, and things go even maybe better than expected, which we may think about the favor Paul had. I mean, maybe Paul expected at some point, wow, I'm not going to ever get off this ship and so forth. And yet he had favor with Julius. And so even that's going well, because like a feedback report or a praise report and say, yeah, things are going okay on the journey. And Paul could have said, yeah, the centurions, God give us a great centurion. So to me, it shows that even in our life, when we embark upon a mission or embark upon a journey, that things may seem to go well to begin with, or better than expected maybe, and that's what I get from that. Verse 5 actually says, when we sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. No problems. They sailed across that open sea. They got to where they were going, and it looked really routine and normal. That's
Then verse 6 there, the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy
okay.
and put us on board. We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Cnidus. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete opposite Salmone. We moved across the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens near the town of Lycia. So that's right down to verse 8.
Yeah, a quick thought on your reading on verse 6, Paul. Notice they changed ships. So they're on that journey. It seemed to be going okay. And then all of a sudden, the centurion says, oh, that's exactly what we want to catch, this new ship, because this has come from Egypt, from Alexandria, and it's going straight to Italy or straight to Rome. Where do we want to sail to? But that's where we want to go. So it's all systems change. And what I've got from that is that the ship on which they first set sail was no longer any use. And I see it here like in the UK we change trains to get to a different destination, or to get to the same place, but we have to go on different trains to get there. In England, in the UK, we change trains at Crewe a lot. If anybody's from the UK, they will understand. Go to Crewe and get off that train and jump on another, probably Birmingham New Street as well, and London's there. All
I
it's
wanted to go to Birmingham, but he put me off at Crewe.
There you go.
That's the song. Yeah.
And so there is Paul, but in those days, obviously, they knew they would catch on a busy trade route a ship that was going to there. It's like a bus to that, the terminus, the bus, it only goes this far, then you've got to catch another bus. So they would have docked at port. Okay, everybody off ship. And that's the one. Excuse me, are you going to Rome? Yeah, we're going to Rome, or we're going to Italy, and on they would get. And I put this a little bit more devotionally, Paul, as well, because it's a bit like Noah's Ark and about the importance of changing things, because Noah's Ark would be no longer any use for saving the world. It was once, it was, right? But it's no use now. It served its purpose back in Genesis, and salvation to the world has changed. And somebody once preached a sermon, an ark for all God knowers. Jesus is the ark for all God's knowers. And there's a bit of a progressive revelation there, and a lot of people, I'm sure, come up with many interesting facts about the ark, but that would be no use. And I think when things are no use, even as holy as they are and as sacred they are, then we need to change them. And that applies to the spiritual things and the practical things in our life. These rockets that go up to space, there's a lot about going to Mars and SpaceX and all of this stuff. They jettison the tanks. When they're so far, they don't necessarily keep all of that. When they go from the launch pad, they only come back and they're only that big. When they started off on the journey, there was like that. And there's a time to jettison spiritually and practically. Not get. I'm all for keeping tradition. I'm all, because Christian traditions are transformative. They're not merely cheap traditions. So that's not what I'm talking about. But I'm talking about some of the practical things. And when they finish their purpose in God's providence and teaching the whole revelation of Scripture, then we have to move on from there. And I just like the idea that they just changed ships, and that was a simple thing to do. And sometimes in life, maybe you're at a point in your Christian life right now and you need to change ship to get to where you need to go. That's just my thoughts on that, Paul.
Okay, good points, Kevin. Yes. So, verse 9, much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because now it was after the day of atonement. So Paul warned them, men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, and to our own lives also. But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship, since the harbour was unsuitable to winter in. The majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbour in Crete facing both southwest and northwest.
I've got things to say on that, but is there anything you want to kick off, or do you want me to do that?
Well, you're doing well at the moment, Kevin. You go first.
Okay. Interestingly, so whose big idea was it to catch this ship? Like, we was doing okay, and then when we get on this ship, when we change ships, I mean, was it Kev Coley's idea to change the ship? Anyway, what I get from that, the delay. It's interesting. We ran into further delays. We talked about the 2 years Paul was kept in custody, but here on the sailing and the journey. We've seen the goodwill and that from the centurion, and we've seen that it was okay to begin with. They had clement weather, but they ran into all kinds of difficulties, and it was suddenly going slow and difficult, and the strong wind was blowing. We said initially things can go pretty good, and then all of a sudden a strong wind started to create issues, and they were very practical. They took shelter in a port when they needed to. And all I'd say is be practical, seek protection when you need to in life, save yourself from burnout. Sit back sometimes and think, I'm under a lot of stress right now. There's a lot of metaphorical winds blowing against me, and I just perhaps need to take time out, need to think. If you're in a group that's gone toxic, or you're in situations that's toxic, look, take shelter from those situations in prayer cover, but practically, and so forth. And that delay, you got to recognize them in God's plan, and I'm sure, I mean, when I traveled to Boscastle, I was irritable on the journey, the motorway and that. And you may be rocking about, and if you're on the back seat, you may suffer from travel sickness. I mean, don't forget they had seasickness. They didn't have seasickness tablets. They didn't have the bands we can put on and travel. And I'm sure they're kind of thinking, oh, this is a bit of a journey, really. And then they caused them delays. Recognize the delays in God's plan for your life. Not easy to do. Delays are not denials, as we often say. But there was one. I mean, they went and spent a few months in Malta as well, the winter. But it's what they call the dangerous season for sailing, Paul. When Paul warned them, the Apostle Paul, he warned them, and it was a dangerous season, and it shows you how the Christian life is vulnerable to real dangers. We say we got God's protection, but the dangers we face and the risks we face are really true, and they're really genuine. And the Apostle Paul, notice, we know God's got control over the ocean. I preached a series about Jehovah being Lord of the sea, and I talked about the incidents that happened on the sea. God's got control over the weather. But notice the Apostle Paul's not binding up the weather and saying, right, we'll pray for good weather. Paul's saying, don't do this. This is inclement weather here. And he's an apostle. He's raised the dead. He's got faith. He's planted churches. He's done miracles. And he's saying, look, this is not good weather. We best not sail. Otherwise, we're going to lose everything. Ship, cargo, and crew are at risk. And that's a big risk, Paul, to be honest. I'll talk about the admonishment in a moment, but is there anything you see about that risk and about Paul's advice?
I think Paul had made a friend of Julius, as we saw last week, because Julius, the centurion, was kind to Paul, showed him favor. And Julius must have been thinking, I should really listen to Paul, because I know he's a man of faith. He's got insight. And he would have probably gone along with Paul had he not been put under pressure from the owner of the ship, who wanted to get his whatever cargo they were taking to where it should be so that he could get paid. And the pilot also said, yeah, let's go. So Paul had some insight here, and it's like the Christian voice may be a small voice and it's not always listened to in the world. People go their own way, but it's the still small voice that we ought to listen to. It's not in the earthquake, it's not in the fire, it's not in what's expedient for us to do. It's what is the Lord saying. And if we get before the Lord, as Paul did, we get insight, like Paul got insight. And it's important that we do that and that we listen to the voice of the Spirit and obey the voice of the Spirit. But Julius, he hadn't got the experience or the strength of that spiritual character that he needed to listen to Paul and say, no, this is what we're doing.
Yeah. Do you know what? That's a brilliant observation. The relationship between Paul and Julius, the ship's crew, the pilot. It's really interesting because the Paul's in that meeting. And there is a thought that Paul was a seasoned traveler. So Paul got a lot of experience of traveling and being at sea. You know, he was shipwrecked, I think, was it 3 times in his journeys? I can't remember. It could have been more, but he saw all kinds of things on the journeys. He visited places, and this guy, we'll talk about briefly his spiritual stuff in a second, a brief summary as we finish, but he's a seasoned traveler, the Apostle Paul, and I understand why the centurion would want the Apostle Paul on board, because he must have said things about his life and his journey. I mean, he was even born again on traveling on the road to Damascus as well. So his whole life was traveling. And what I like, or what I'm challenged by, is well, they listen to the experts instead of Paul's advice. And it says admonish, but what it means is Paul offered his advice. And as Christians, I'm sure we've done that. And I feel, God, give me wisdom if ever I've got to offer advice, because sometimes we wait till we must. But I think Paul was that agitated in what he saw, that insight God had given him. He thought, I've got to offer my advice. And very often somebody says, don't offer your opinion, don't offer your advice. God's opinion is different, but don't offer it unless you're asked. But I think Christians at times not admonish, God, give me the best way I can offer advice in some situations. How the experts were listened to, but the Spirit of God on this occasion, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, was not listened to. So that's where I'm at on the sailing bit.
So rather than saying unfortunately or fortunately, maybe we should say providentially.
Providentially, and it's how God overrode that decision, because he said to Paul, well, you've listened to me. Everything's going to be lost, but I'm not the ship's crew, not the people. That's the most important thing. So those experts, the pilot and the ship's owner, if they'd have decided otherwise, might have kept the cargo. You know, they probably didn't have insurance in those days. So the decision that seemed most obvious was the wrong decision, and maybe the owner of the ship and the owners of the cargo would have come out a lot better, because, and it shows you how God is genuinely concerned about those things, because God says, all right, they made the wrong decision, but Paul, not one life will be lost. I'll give you the lives. But the cargo went.
And that comes in the next video when we look at the storm. So I think we can say we've covered the sailing bit now.
Yeah.
So then next week we'll pick up the storm section.
Yeah, maybe. Again, if anybody's listening to this, could you give us a time when somebody accepted your advice or rejected your advice as a Christian. You found God's way in. Be great to get a comment or feedback if somebody could say this happened, and who knows, maybe one or two might be persuaded to write to us about that.
Okay. Okay. Thanks so much for your insight, Kevin. It's been really good. Thank you.
All right, man. Thanks for yours as well.